All right, we are going to go ahead and kick things off here. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the, what's the date? February 20th, 2024 meeting of the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Planning Commission's Planning Committee. We're in the Government Center in room 280. This meeting is also being live streamed on the Planning Department's YouTube page for those that are unable to join us in person. Let's jump straight into it, starting with introductions. We'll begin with our commissioners. On my left, Commissioner Shaw.
Erin Shaw, Planning Committee.
Douglas Welton, substitute Planning Committee member tonight.
Courtney Rose, Planning Committee. Melissa Gaston, Planning Committee.
And then Alicia, if you wouldn't mind keeping it going.
Alicia Osborne, Planning Staff.
Zania Duhaney, Planning Staff.
Cornett, Planning Staff.
Erin Hinson, Planning Staff. Tolu Ibikunle, Planning Staff.
David Craning, County Stormwater.
Jonathan Beller, County Stormwater.
Abby Bonavac, Planning Staff.
Jason Pauling, Planning Staff.
Just two more.
Gretchen Flores, Planning Staff. Hi, I'm Tara Moore. I'm the Tree Canopy Programs Manager, Planning.
Perfect. Thank you all very much. We'll begin with the approval of the minutes from our, as a reminder, our last meeting, we actually did not have anything on the agenda in January. So we have not met since December 19th of 2023. So Happy New Year's. And if somebody could please, unless there's any discussion, motion to approve the minutes from our previous meeting.
Motion to approve. Shaw.
Gaston, second.
All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All right, thank you very much. We have 5 mandatory referrals on the agenda this evening. I know I have one specifically that I would like to just ask a question on of Tara. But before we get there, does anybody else have any questions, comments, or mandatory referrals that they would like to pull? All right. I don't necessarily need to pull this, just a question for you, Tara. This is on mandatory referral 24-03, the tree canopy preservation project on North Tryon Street. And as I just mentioned to you briefly, for example, 02, you were looking at what, 41, almost 42 acres, right? In the less dense part of town. North Tryon is not the cheapest real estate in town, and obviously it's not the largest parcel either, just 1.68 acres. And so if you could share any insight, like I just mentioned, kind of how is that bang worth the buck, right? If you want to just use the mic that Kathy has, that's no problem.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Andrew. Yes, so that's definitely something that we were thinking about when we went for this site because it's a similar price to the other property, which is 40 acres. So obviously that's something to really think about. We've been collecting a lot of fees from this part of the city. So it's in the northeast part. So a lot of the fees have been coming in from over here. So we've been really looking at buying properties in this area. Additionally, the quality of the trees on this site are particularly great. So we went out there and we were like, wow, this is great to protect a lot of the white oaks over here. So we decided that that was worth it, upped the property value for us. And additionally, it backs up to the Cross Charlotte Trail. So that's a connection piece that we thought was kind of a necessary thing to think about. Obviously, it costs more than some of the others, but with those 3 kind of pieces there, it made sense to us to go forward with this one. We don't have as many pieces in this area over here, so we decided to move forward with that.
Well, I appreciate it. I like that there are going to be some more quote infill parcels, right, that are for tree canopy preservation. But again, just curious how those calculations work. So thank you very much. Commissioner Welton.
Is the structure that's on the property going to remain? I visited that.
Yes, we are not sure yet if it's going to stay there. We are looking into options potentially to do something with it. If not, then we're going to demolish it, and then we're going to plant trees there. So we have some options that we're thinking about, but it's definitely something that we've considered with the site.
Okay, thank you.
Anybody else? Questions, comments? Well, in that case, I don't think we have any comments on that mandatory referral, so we can still make a motion for all five at once. If somebody would like to go ahead and kick that off for us, please.
The planning committee reviewed mandatory referral reports, 24-01, 24-02, 24-03, 24-04, 24-05, and 24-06 on February 20th, 2024. We have no additional comments for the submitting agency.
Second.
Gaston, second.
We have a motion by Commissioner Rhodes, second by Commissioner Gaston. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All right, thank you very much. Moving on in the agenda, our next presentation is one that we unfortunately had to push back a month because of all the storms we had in January, but thank you for your flexibility. I believe it was through a mandatory referral previously we'd heard about kind of, or we're continued to be made aware of the importance of stormwater services and some of kind of the outlook. And I don't know if it's a 5-10 year horizon, but I guess that's what we're here to learn about. So again, is David presenting this evening? Okay, got it. So David, very much looking forward to this, and just let us know how you want us to handle it. If you want to present, we ask questions afterwards. If you just want us to kind of interject in between, whatever's better for you.
Just interrupt me. And it's better if we just address any questions as they arise.
Perfect. Well, thank you for being here.
Sure. So stormwater services, particular county stormwater services, we're responsible for the FEMA floodplain. Charlotte stormwater, they're responsible for the smaller streams, those draining like less than a square mile. That's where the break is. The little streams are the responsibility of the city. The bigger streams are the responsibility of the county. So that's what I'm here talking about today is essentially our county stormwater's responsibilities, part of which is called flood mitigation, where we try to reduce flood risk in our community. That's the ultimate goal. John Beller's here. He's come to some of the meetings. He's really the guy who administers this. The program, actually, there's two programs that we use to reduce this flood risk. All the mitigation work we do is guided by this thing called the Flood Risk Assessment and Risk Reduction Plan. It was put out in 2012, and it has guided the mitigation program ever since. We've kind of been at this business of mitigation, particularly through acquisition and demolition of flood-prone structures since about '99. So, we've been at this for a minute. This plan was developed with input from a citizen review committee. There were 12 citizens that provided input to this from 7 neighborhoods, 3 watersheds, and they gave us input on how we score properties and the mitigation techniques that should be employed in various situations. So it's really important for me to make sure that you're aware this is a completely voluntary program. We do not condemn. We have the power of condemnation as a utility, but we do not condemn for flood mitigation purposes. We really are there to offer citizens an alternative, perhaps, to rather than repairing a severely damaged house in the floodplain after a flood. We can do an acquisition or help them to fix their homes in certain situations. But this is a completely voluntary program. So us doing sort of draconian planning, saying we're going to buy this, we're going to buy that, and we're going to buy that, it doesn't work that way. And we work with property owners to figure out what the best solution is for them. So the core, the heart of this thing is a scoring metric that we developed along with that citizen committee. And it's essentially an impact-based scoring metric. And it is determined by assigning probability to various flood impacts. When I say probability, it's how often something happens. So for us, it's storms. How often, a return interval. You may hear of somebody talk about a 100-year storm. You may hear people talk about a 50-year storm. Well, here locally, we have modeled floodplains for something called a 2-year storm, 5, 10, 25, 50, 100-year, 500-year, and also a future condition floodplain that we use to manage the risk in these flood zones. So that's really the probability. It's how often something happens, and it's akin to these return interval storms. So if we call something a 2-year storm, there's a 50-50 chance we're going to get that in any given year. And for the 10-year storm, well, that equates to a 10% chance in any year that we're going to get that. We're going to get that storm, get that flood event. So that's kind of how often something happens, and the severity of those impacts are really kind of the two things that drive the bus as far as the flood risk scoring is concerned. Again, it's location. There's a location-based scoring as well as the probability, and it's essentially where maybe a structure is in a high velocity zone, if there's expected to be really fast moving water during a flood event, or slow moving water, or something like that. So if there's something in particular that makes an area really dangerous, there's a multiplier applied to the score. And all this stuff is determined via modeling. So these are our components, and there's a lot of like kind of industry vernacular here, but essentially these are the components that we use to score the flood risk on a property. If you look at component A that says FFE, what that means is finished floor. If there's flooding in the living space, that's what component A is. Component B, mechanical flooding, mechanical equipment, your furnace, ductwork, maybe in the crawl space, or the compressor outside. That's what that is evaluating. Lag flooding, that's called lowest adjacent grade. What that's getting at is the ground elevation adjacent to a home. It's the lowest point. So if the water elevation gets above that lowest elevation, it's going to be in the crawl space. So essentially that's giving us an indicator of how often water is getting in a crawl space. Again, one of the community values that we really focus upon is not just the homeowner, the citizen, the property owner, but it's also our first responders, because they're the folks that are going to have to go out. And so that was a big point that we tried to stress, and the citizen group tried to stress. And those things about the building being surrounded, essentially, if the building is surrounded by water, that means that we're going to have to send swift water rescue in. So that's considered as well. And then that component I critical facility surrounded, component F. Again, if that's consideration for our first responders, things like daycares. We have daycares in the floodplain, not anymore, but that was one of the first things we dealt with. Schools, any sort of concentrations of people that are in some way going to need extra help in case there is a flood. So all those things are scored in. We look at a building and we figure out all these different potential impacts from the flooding. So if we look at a particular property, here's Polaris. This is actually a house that's no longer there. So we don't have any sort of, have to betray anybody's trust with this, but you can see the shaded blue area is the floodplain. You can see it's encroaching on the envelope of the house. The creek's down here. It's McMullen Creek. And we're just going to kind of take a look at that one as sort of an example of how we score things and might use that. So you may remember that component A is how often there's water. We expect water to be in the living space. Well, the base score for that is 2,800. That was the highest scored component that we, in our system. If there's water in somebody's living space, that's devastating. So that has the highest potential base score. And on that structure, we expect there to be water in that living space in the 10-year event. So there's a 10% chance in any given year that there's going to be water in that family's living space. So how we score that is the 10-year event gets in the living space. There's a 10% chance of that happening. So we assign 10% of the points from the base score, or 280 points to that component for that structure. If it happens more frequently, if something were to, let's say the 2-year, well, there's a 50% chance of that happening. So we take the base score and multiply it by 0.5 and we would have gotten 1400. So the more frequently something happens, the higher the score.
And then those are cumulative?
Yeah,
And then, so if any part of a structure is in one of those layers, then that gets factored in, correct?
yeah. So for this particular structure, you can see all of the different components get scored. Again, 280 points for finished floor flooding, got 24 points for mechanical flooding, 100 for flooding, against the building or in the crawl space. Vehicular flooding, yard flooding, structure damage, and you can see that it tags the flood event next to it, that sort of impact would happen. So you add all these up and you get the base score for this structure. And for this one, it was 579. Now we have these, I mentioned these location-based multipliers. If a structure is located like in a high velocity zone, as far when it's flooding, we expect the velocities or the depths to be extraordinarily high. We would apply a multiplier to it. This structure did not have a location-based multiplier in it. So its base score is 579. No multiplier, so that's the score. Now I want you to remember there'll be another example in a minute or two, but the score here is 579. It had finished floor flooding, in the 10-year, or there was a 10% chance any given year that kind of flooding was going to occur. So this is a little bit disjointed here. I apologize for this, but I probably should have put this in front of the example. But this is just for finished floor flooding, and this is kind of a little caricature of what that means. It's actually water. That blue line showing water in the living space, and then here's the finished floor flooding examples and how often that happens, and the points are assigned. And then crawl space flooding, it's flooding. How often does water get in the crawl space? And the points. And how often is the building surrounded? Again, this is the points that we're considering our first responders. And so it's not the highest level, but it's definitely something that we want to consider. Protection, make sure our emergency responders are safe is a big deal. So another example. So this one has a much higher score than that original example. Remember the 579, the finished floor flooding in the 10-year or the 10% annual chance. But this one has no finished floor flooding. And the only effective technique was acquisition. So the flood score alone doesn't tell the whole story, but we use it as an indicator. This property is in Sherwood Forest. We've acquired it. 5129 Lindcrest, right there, right next to McMullen Creek. You can see McMullen Creek kind of cutting through diagonally through the photo there. And you see in the red circle, the house was just squeezed in at the edge of the property line because, the way the floodplain was configured. So that house is just completely squeezed in there out of the floodway. They wouldn't let it put it in the floodway, so it's sitting in the floodplain. So the risk score here was 1,777 points, so roughly 3 times higher than the previous one. But there was no finished floor flooding. It was built in 1990 under the old maps, and like I said, it was squeezed into the lot. So let's look at how they got to that kind of score without finished floor flooding. And over here, you can see that there's a bunch of points awarded for, flooding in the crawl space. This home was elevated. It was well off the ground, but water was getting in that crawl space every 2 years, or there was a 50% chance that was going to happen in any given year. It was, the property was surrounded in the 2-year. So there were emergency responders were having to respond all the time and there was vehicular flooding in the 2-year. There was, the building was surrounded, property was surrounded. So this was an ongoing problem. Anytime we had, flooding going on, the news media would kind of go out there and they knew that there was going to be flooding. So it was a known problem, and therefore it did have a high score. Additionally, it had this location multiplier where it was in the community encroachment area, which is one of those areas of floodplain that we define. So it had a multiplier of 1.1 applied. And that's how we get to that really high flood score. It's because, yeah, it didn't have finished floor flooding, but the impacts that it did have were happening just repeatedly over and over and over again. And we're having to spend community resources to go out there, make sure everybody's okay, potentially doing swift water rescues, et cetera. So it's not, the scores are not just about living space flooding. We try to take into consideration all the other aspects that were important and are important to the community. And so the score is really, but the score is really the base tool that we use to judge how flood prone a particular property is. Higher the score, the higher the flood prone the property is. So if we look at sort of the whole enchilada, all of the flood risk in our community, we've got roughly 5,000 buildings that have some sort of flood risk associated with them. And the scores really range from over 1,000. You saw that one on Lindcrest, it was at 1,700, to less than 10. From our perspective, things greater than 1,000 points are high risk. Those are important for us to really look hard at potentially acquiring. Things between 400 to scores between 400 to 1,000, that's kind of moderate. There's definitely risk there, but it's not like things are happening every other year. And then the less than 400 are really the lower risk scores. Those are, we still do mitigation work on those properties. And in particular, we do work on those properties and could potentially acquire them if one of our partner agencies sees a need for an acquisition. We partner often with Charlotte Water. We partner with Park and Rec. We partner with City Stormwater to acquire properties where it may not make sense for us to pull full freight, but if Charlotte Water is going to spend money buying an easement to use as a laydown area, and we are interested in, it doesn't make sense to us to acquire this property, but it may make sense to acquire it if, both of the utilities are contributing funding. And then the community has some more open space. And that really is what happens with the acquisition program. We buy these properties, we tear down the structure, and then the land is returned to open space. Some communities use it for community gardens. Greenways used it for greenways, and we've used it for planting areas. These properties definitely are prized by a lot of the neighborhoods. The one down in Lindcrest, we bought 10, 12 structures down there in that bottom part of Lindcrest and Sherwood Forest. The community uses those open space, that open space all the time, because there's really not much park property over that way. But anyhow, back to our risk pool here. 5,000 structures, high, moderate, and low risk. And that pie chart shows you we've got about 100 structures still in this community that we consider high risk, another 250 that are in the moderate risk, and the remainder of the 5,000 kind of in the lower risk categories. So 5,000 structures, the whole risk pool, there's currently about 565,000 points out there in the community. And if you look at 5,000 structures, 565,000 points, that means, roughly 100, on average, about 100 points per structure. So where are we? I mentioned we've been at this game since about 1999, 2000. And the line chart over here, this is where we started back in 2000. And we've mitigated around half of the flood risk in the community. Roughly, 200 or 500,000, we've got about 500,000 points left out there. We won't go to zero in this community. The way that the scoring mechanism has been set up is, we're not going to go and acquire a structure because there's yard flooding. Yard flooding it can be an annoyance. It takes down fences, there's cleanup to do. And so we assign some flood risk to that, but we're not going to go and buy that structure over yard flooding. Similarly, there are other things, maybe crawl space flooding in the 500-year event. It's the cost benefit of mitigated something like that may not be worth it. So there will be flood risk out there even after we're completely done mitigating. And that's what that bar on the bottom, we call it community risk tolerance, or we call it residual risk. There's going to be risk out there even when we're done completely mitigating everything. The yellow line is showing kind of the next 15 years, about the amount of risk we think we're going to mitigate in the next 15 years. We developed a CIP program back in 2022 that is focused on driving that flood risk, the existing flood risk, the remaining flood risk, down to that residual level. So that's really what we're operating under now. And this is essentially that CIP. We're going to try to mitigate by the end of the 15-year CIP, another roughly 200,000 flood risk points by FY36. And John, do you remember the number, the amount of money that is? It's like 200 million? Yes. I want to say
More than that.
okay. Significant amount of money over the next 15 years. On average, if for an acquisition, we're spending about $500 to $1,000 per point through acquisitions. Since the revaluation, that number's gone up, obviously. Property values in this community are one of the headwinds that we face to try to do more mitigation work. And things just cost more. We're having to invest more money, but we are always chasing grants from FEMA. We're always looking for partnerships, like I mentioned earlier, with Charlotte Water, Park and Rec, City Stormwater, anybody that'll work with us where there's some flood risk reduction or benefit, we are willing to partner with them to try to make things happen.
Do you work with private organizations?
Well, we have a sort of sister program to the acquisition program. It's called Retrofit, and it provides grant funding to individual property owners to help to mitigate their homes. Things that, in other words, if they want to stay there, and let's say their home floods, but an elevation project might be a solution. We can provide funding for up to 75% of the cost to elevate those structures. You want to say anything more about that, John?
Just that we're trying to partner with organizations to help bridge that gap. That
Okay.
25% gap between what the homeowner is responsible for and what we pay for with that grant program. But we're not
Okay.
successful yet.
A part of, things just flash into my mind. I don't know what they are, but once you all have acquired a piece of property, my understanding is that it can no longer be developed on as a residential property. Is that correct?
Well, if it's purchased by the utility, okay, if it's purchased using FEMA funds,
FEMA funds.
then it's done. I mean, it is open space from here to eternity. If it's purchased using local funds and the county owns it, I don't know that there's any of those requirements. And we do purchase a lot of the structures entirely with county or utility funding.
Okay.
Those, I don't know that that requirement exists on those.
Yeah, I just wondered from a land use perspective, were we going to run into a case where someone was willing to extend some funds to purchase things to be repurposed and then redevelop? But I'm not sure if that's a case that will pop up very frequently.
I've not seen it.
Okay.
I don't know of any.
I don't think we
Flood
would
mitigation.
partner with a private entity for an acquisition. It would
Okay.
just be more to keep somebody in their home.
We have done things where I think purchased floodplains to make sure the floodplain is not redeveloped. We're a subdivision of a piece of property, things like that. So we try to be creative, and in some cases we've done purchases just to prevent development from happening in the future. But to the best of my knowledge, nothing that we've purchased has ever been redeveloped other than for Park and Rec sort of uses.
Right.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep.
I have a question.
Yeah.
To follow to this point, so I know a particular area behind the Parker Shop, I guess that's.
Westfield?
Yes, Westfield. So now I remember back in California, because I was thinking about buying a lot. Back in
You
the day.
saw it on television. Let's go with that.
I'm sorry.
You saw it on television, so it's.
Okay, but no, okay, so, anyway, but I know that some people have since, they took the lots and, I know they were working on the Sugar Greenway and all
Yeah.
that kind of stuff. But people have since built houses on lots that did not have houses on them, because I'm assuming
So the structures that are there now, the new ones, were generally, and that's really our ordinance at work. We did not purchase those. They were sort of marginal cost benefit. But that's a very desirable area. So individuals and developers would purchase those small structures, small homes, tear them down. Generally, what they would do is bring dirt in and fill the ground level up to what was above the floodplain elevation, and then build the house. And so what we're going to have out there when it floods are little islands. And so our first responders are still going to have to go out there, but the living space is not going to flood. They're going to have vehicular flooding. There's still flood risk out there. That's what I'm talking about with the residual risk. You know, those things they're compliant with our ordinances now. And so they've kind of, how would you say it, self-mitigated. We have participated in some grant out there for the old non-compliant structures to be torn down. And we recently bought a house on Hillside in Westfield.
Yeah,
Right on the corner.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's a few more in there that, you know, that back up right to the creek where we would be interested in acquiring them. But when we approached them, when the Greenway was going in and we were doing all the other mitigation work, they just weren't interested.
So, but now, if you were to go, so would you, like, for that particular, that you said you just bought something recently?
Yeah.
So now, nobody else would ever go and build on that because it was purchased.
That's correct. I don't think there's any ordinance prohibiting that, but it's never occurred. In other words, I think the county could sell its property if it so desired. It was not purchased. There's no rider on the deed like there would be if we had used FEMA funding for the acquisition. It was funded completely with local stormwater money. Sure. So we've discussed this decision-making process about how we've got these scores. The scores tell us what the risk is, but how do we decide what to do for a particular structure? And I use the example of acquisition. Acquisition works everywhere. If we go and buy a structure, tear it down, we know that structure is not going to flood. You know, it's done. But should we really be doing that in a situation where they only have yard flooding, or they may get, you know, flooding of their driveway? Probably not. That's probably not a good use of the community's funding. So we developed this thing called the viability index. So we use the viability index to kind of layer on top of the flood score. And that's kind of how we make decisions. At least that's one of the stronger indicators of how we make decisions. This table is probably illegible, but what I'll do is I'll just go to the endpoint here. The viability score is essentially something that takes price into consideration, and it takes flood risk into consideration. What this allows us to do is decide, you know, if the risk is here and the cost is there, does this make sense for us to do an acquisition? So it takes both the risk and the money into consideration, essentially. How viable is this solution? What this allowed us to do is really dive into deciding, like, how many houses are out there that we think we should buy? Well, the intersection of the cost and the risk is really how we make those decisions, and that's how we plan for our 15-year CIP. I'm trying not to get into the details of this, but it's essentially risk and money and how those things, where they intersect, and that's how we decide whether to buy or not. And I'll just show you then how we use this data. We have a dashboard that anytime someone approaches us saying, hey, I live on XYZ, I flooded it back in January, or I had water in my crawl space in January, I'd like to sell. This is the first place we go to check that out. And so this is where all of the data is, and I'll just show you a little bit. So we have the whole county. And, oops, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Can we make requests for an area to look at?
Sure.
The intersection of Ray Road and Bevington.
Ray Road, I know that's South Charlotte.
And there may be a terrible example, I'm just curious about now.
So where am I here? Ray Road. Sharon, Providence, Colony. Colony is the same as Ray, isn't it?
Yes.
Colony, Carmel, Ray.
Yeah.
Okay, which way?
Down south of 51, before you get to 485. Oh, that's it, right up underneath the thing that says Charlotte.
Okay.
Yeah, well, 4 Mile Creek, I should have said that, shouldn't I?
Oh, yeah, I've chatted with a bunch of people about this area.
Yes, you have.
Yeah. So we have data on these structures here. I don't see a whole lot of flood prone structures here. Everything's kind of, you see this kind of around the perimeter of the shaded areas of floodplain, sorry. We have Acre Hill. I know we've had flooding here on Acre Hill. One really important thing to recognize about flood risk in our community is it follows age of development. Those areas that were developed before the mid-70s have a lot more flood risk than those developed after the mid-70s. And the reason for that is flood maps. That's when the flood maps came out, the FEMA flood maps. That's when we started adopting our local ordinances to essentially stay out of the floodplain, or you had to be above the flood prone elevation. So that's really the designator. So what you've got are areas of the stuff that was developed back in the 50s and 60s, early 70s. That's where most of our flood risk is. It's older development. But if we just click on one of these, I'm trying to remember which one of these flooded. But the information that we have, so that structure is non-compliant, meaning that the floor elevation is not compliant with our ordinances. The score is 60, so it's not a high risk property, very low risk. And again, probably because it was developed, later than the mid-70s. It can have finished floor flooding in that 500-year event. So that means there's like 0.2% chance of it happening every given year, very low risk. We do have some mechanical flooding in the 100-year, but these are all big events that don't happen very often. So if we look at what we should do about this flood risk, acquisition, demolition, it didn't even come up as an option for this one because the risk is so low. Really, what we're looking at, the only thing that we would consider doing out there is maybe providing that homeowner with a grant to elevate their mechanical equipment, because it floods somewhat frequently. So that's how this is kind of how we interact with this data on a daily basis. John interacts with it on a daily basis to understand, is this something we should buy? Is this something we should talk with the homeowner or the property owner about, elevating their mechanical equipment? Should they be elevating the whole structure? This is where we come to find that. But you can tell from this, we've got data on, like I said, over 5,000 structures throughout the community. And you see there's flood risk here, but it's just not, it doesn't happen with the frequency that would indicate an acquisition would be in order out here.
Go ahead, please.
So I have a question about another area that I see frequently, see it on the news, and I pass it a million times. But it's over there, Plaza Midwood, where it's the townhouses and they flood all the time.
Oh, on Commonwealth?
Commonwealth, yeah. So now why is that an area where they're constantly flooding? Like, it seems like every year.
Yeah.
every year.
Let me get myself oriented here.
But yet,
Oh, that's where it like turned into a river in January.
yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah.
on Briar Creek.
Yeah.
but yet, is it because the owners, there's so many different owners and they're like, no, we're not selling? So we're just gonna let it continue to flood? I know that.
Those condos right there.
Yeah,
So condos present a unique challenge for us.
okay.
The way how our program works and the way our legal folks have told us we need to work is when we buy something, we've got to come away with real property. We can't just buy a building and leave the dirt. So when you're dealing with a condo association, everybody's in the condo association has got to be willing to subdivide that parcel and give us a chunk. Now, it has happened, you may remember Doral Cavalier Apartments. It can happen, but it is extremely challenging from a bureaucratic standpoint. But there they are. These are the buildings I think you're talking about. Briar Creek and those condo buildings. We've approached that group. Excuse me? Sure.
So also at brief glance, when we're looking at the map, they're color coded, those colors indicate the level of risk at quick glance. Okay.
Yeah, the hotter colors are higher risk, but score there on that building is 545. Most viable technique. I mean, a 10 is not a good score. We're trying to do things between 1 and 5 for acquisition. It's tough. It's tough to work on condos, townhomes, where there's group ownership. It's just, we have a concentration of flood risk there it's right off Selwyn, right on the Greenway Trail, where essentially what happens East Boulevard, Queens Road West, Brandywine. Wakefield. So this building in particular has flooded a bunch. The building is actually falling off of its foundation. It's been undermined by flooding. But for us to buy, there's 4 units in that condo. We have to get all four to agree, and we have to get the whole HOA to agree. Well, the people on the top floor, they don't flood. So they're not, they're just, happy. It's just like, yeah, that goes in doesn't mind, I don't flood.
In the
So-
last storm, though, a tree fell on that. I think it fell on that unit.
Yeah.
They had the roof 4 feet down. I drove by there on my bike the other day.
Yeah. I go by here on the Greenway all the time.
Yeah.
And I look at it every time. I'm like, why can't we get something done here? We could get FEMA funding to buy that, but we haven't been able to figure out how to make it work.
Do you guys update, it rained a bunch in January. Did all of your numbers change in January, or does it only change when you get a new FEMA map, so to speak?
New FEMA map, exactly.
How
Yeah.
often are those metrics updated?
We revisit everything annually. Recalculate, we do an annual CIP report, which talks about the things we did and all.
Okay.
At that point, we recalculate everything. It's a substantial amount of work.
Yeah.
for a
And what about
GIS
it?
analyst.
What about as far as like your outreach when you, you created this in 2012 and maybe you had more than 5,000 properties then that you were looking at. And I know that didn't mean all of the properties were on the list for acquisition, but you narrowed it down to whatever, 10% of those. Are you literally knocking on doors of those people to say, hey, the people obviously are aware. So you're kind of like, hey, are you aware, that you're in this floodplain? This is a major risk. Are you interested in a sale program, or is it more you sort of watch the market and wait and see what happens with those homes? Or is there maybe different scales depending on the risk?
So we do the most of the work after floods. That's when most of the action happens. We had flooding in January. We've got a lot of interest in the program from that. During the periods in between floods, yeah. Especially if we get FEMA funding for an acquisition or an elevation project where we can bring outside money into the community to help reduce the flood risk, yes, we will go knock on doors, absolutely. But generally speaking, we get the most work. Was it Winston Churchill that said, never let a good catastrophe go to waste? I mean, it's terrible, these people flooded, don't get me wrong, but then it becomes very real to them, their risk. And it's like, I don't want to live like this, or I want to elevate, and that's when we're actually able to do the most work. Fortunately and fortunately, you know.
We also send out annual mailers to every property with flood programs, both retrofit and acquisition.
And we're actually doing an elevation workshop in a couple of months where because of this tool, we know where elevation of a structure is going to work. So we are doing targeted mailings to all those people and offering to buy them dinner if they let us talk to them about elevating their property. So this data set allows us to target our outreach to say, hey, elevation might benefit you. It'll reduce your flood insurance. It'll make you sleep better at night, sort of thing. Come and let us tell you about it, sort of thing. So the tool extends just beyond just that understanding of risk, but how to deal with it and what people can do about it, sort of thing.
So quickly, David, this is what can sometimes happen when you let us interrupt you with questions. We have this room until 7. I want to be cognizant of your time and make sure that you have time to get through the presentation as well. I'm sure everyone else has a few more questions as well, but again, just want to make sure that you have time to get through what you need to get through.
I'm done. I mean, I was just basically showing you the tool.
Oh, perfect. Okay, cool.
So I'm happy to go look at areas or whatever I've never done this before. It's kind of fun. It's like spin the wheel or something.
Again, just being cognizant of your time. If you guys have a hard stop, let us know. My questions are going to be pretty easy answers, I think, but I know at least Commissioners Rhodes and Gaston have some.
My wife is making fish tacos tonight, so keep that in mind.
All right.
We'll make it quick. It's Taco Tuesday.
Yeah, right. All right. Well, in that case, we'll just kind of open it up. Anybody with
Sure,
questions?
of course, I'll be happy to answer your questions.
So I have a question specifically since we're talking about the Selwyn place. What seems to be the drawback when you're like, we know about properties right now, the money, I'm pretty sure is an issue. So my question to you, when you approach homeowners, is it fair market value? Is it like, what calculations do you take into consideration? And do you think that that's holding them back because they feel like they could get more for their property? What kind of goes into that process?
So until recently, yes, it was fair market value. Because of our recognition and sort of look back on our data from an environmental justice lens, we're starting to realize that when we give somebody fair market value in some areas, let's say they had a three bedroom, 2 bath, that they can't go elsewhere in the community and buy an equivalent home for what we can offer them there. So we're essentially displacing them from the community, or they're going to become renters. So kind of in a pilot, McDowell Farms neighborhood, which is off South Tryon, we actually get paid above market value so that people could have a better chance of staying in the community. We don't force them to stay in the community. They're free to do what they want to, but at least get them to the point where they can likely get an equivalent or nearly equivalent home. That's something we recognize is a potential downfall. We don't keep track. After we do a transaction with an individual property owner, we don't keep track of that outcome. That's another thing that we've recognized. We actually have one of our staff members that's working on sort of following the outcomes from our buyout program. And so that's something we're looking at as well. And John mentioned the retrofit program. If someone that's not so well heeled, an elevation would work for their property. An elevation is $150,000. Even if the utility pays 75%, that's $75,000. Well, they still got to come up with $25,000, and then that's an obstacle. So we're recognizing that these are good programs, but they're not able to be utilized by everyone. So
we also recognize that not only market rate, but also interest rates So that was another hurdle that we had to deal with, and came up with a way to compensate for interest rates, because even though we're giving somebody fair market value, they might have a 3% interest rate, then when they go buy something, they're gonna get 9% interest rate. And so we took that into consideration as well.
Well,
Yeah,
and
so that's
just-
not policy. We did that for one neighborhood, but, I think we're not gonna be competitive unless we can do those sorts of things.
Just to follow on to Courtney's question, so I assume their alternative is they can take, let's assume they're like, I don't want to live like this, right? They can take the property to market and kind of bet on, market conditions and, a buyer that does poor diligence, let's say, and they can presumably transact at probably a higher value. Is that kind of what you're saying? So you give them an offer and they may be able to get 20 or 30% more on the open market, and kind of, maybe they're not doing the right thing really, but at the same time, money's obviously important to to most of us to be able to live. So is that kind of their alternative, or is there something prohibiting them from doing that?
Some people just don't want to move. That's a challenge, but we go through, there's a private appraisal process. We pay for the first appraisal. If the homeowner doesn't like that, they're free to get a second appraisal. If it's within 10%, we'll use it. If it's greater than 10%, we pay for a third appraisal and use the middle one, or is it not? Take the average of the three. So they get as far as we go to the, end of the earth to make sure they're getting fair market value. Now, in McDowell Farms, that fair market value was supplemented. So they got a bump, interest rate bump, and property value bump, so that hopefully they're going to be able to stay in the community.
But is there there's nothing like legally or logistically prohibiting them from taking the property to market, kind of not disclosing the condition and trying to sell it to another user of the home, right?
It is illegal to not disclose the condition.
Well, yeah, my point being though, there's no, I guess I'm just saying logistically, is that an option that they have? I'm assuming it is, right? Assuming they can find a lender and the person can find a lender.
You all did a buyout on Wedgewood Road and Mockingbird and
Little
around
Hope Creek, yeah.
Little Hope Creek. A number of my neighbors jumped at that because there was no real estate agent involved.
You don't pay real estate commission, that's correct.
And that was very nice for them to blow out of the neighborhood. There were two people in there that didn't take the deal that I know of. And then one of the remaining people, her house got caught in a hell of a flood, and then she was gone. And there's still an older guy who's probably been there for 50 years and he's gonna die in that house. But again, my friends just said, hey, no real estate fees, we're out.
That's I know things are changing with 6% bump, but the only real catch in all of this is our floodplain ordinances. There's something called substantial damage. Once the home has been damaged, the dollar value of the damages equates to 50% of the value of the structure, not the property, the structure. Then the home has to be brought into compliance, which generally means elevation. So, and John worked on that side of our shop before he did this. But so once a home is damaged enough times, it's declared it's substantially damaged. You can't do anything with it until it's gone, that you tear the structure down or mitigate the flood risk.
Isn't there something on the flip side of that too, where if you buy a property that's in, maybe it's the FEMA floodplain, I'm not sure kind of what level of floodplain, that you can only reinvest up to 50% of the value of that building into it?
That's a substantial improvement.
Yeah,
It's
okay,
kind of those are hand in hand, substantial. If you have $100,000 home, you do a $25,000 renovation and have $30,000 in damages of flood, put you at $55K, that's greater than 50%. You got to bring it into compliance.
Right,
That's
we
the way the
ran into that
ordinances
on
catch that.
Coleman Avenue in Noda.
Yep.
When those were all in the floodplain, and people, very, attractive real estate, right? But
Yeah.
not for that reason.
Oh, and that's some of the most expensive real estate we bought is on Coleman Avenue, and we're trying to get those D-Trex properties, which there's a bunch of chlorinated
Good
solvent
luck, yeah.
contamination, and people are still after those properties, and with all the contamination and environmental
Yeah.
liability that goes with those
Yeah.
properties. And we're,
It was up there the other day.
hopefully we get them eventually, but
I got one more question. So like on Oak Lawn and Angela Terrace,
Andrew Terrace, what neighborhood is that?
that's like what's, that's
I know Andrew.
courthouse. Courthouse.
Yeah.
77. Oak Lawn, yeah.
Oh.
Behind Johnson's Head.
Okay, okay. All right, so that's in this area, right? 77 Beatty's Ford. North?
Gotta go a little bit north.
Which way? Up.
Yeah.
Oh, Andrew. Yeah. We planted a bunch of trees there. Oh, our tree person.
Right, there's a whole lot of trees, so there were properties
Okay,
there, I guess.
Let me,
And so then, is that what would normally occur if you buy the properties, then you contact the tree people and they plant trees, or was that something separate, or how does that work?
our water quality group, who's in county stormwater, has a thing called creek relief where we will replant. We do an evaluation. We try to look at highest and best use for the property. If a community comes to us and says, hey, we want to put a community garden in here, that's fine. You know, we will let that happen and not plant trees. But if there's really no long-term better use than have them reforested, yes, we will reforest them.
The trees were, I've been watching the trees for the longest, I've been like.
I planted a bunch of those trees.
Just seems like they still, okay. Okay.
But you guys work with Tree Charlotte to do
Yeah.
some of those projects, right? Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Well, and she just walked out, but Tara with urban forestry as well. I
Yeah.
mean, we're starting to see more mandatory referrals come through from them. And that could be an interesting
correct.
partnership, like with the one that you guys had tonight over on the river. Right?
Was that,
Or was I think it was on the river.
what, our mandatory referral for tonight?
Oh, yeah, on Lake Drive, 1823 Lake Drive.
Yeah, that's what it was. Right,
Was that-
exactly.
Was that the one that was substantially damaged?
Correct.
So there you go. That's the ordinance at work. That one was on the open market. John called them and said, hey, you're substantially damaged, you know, you can't. And eventually we got it. And so the ordinance helps to prevent, you know, those sorts of things from happening. Here was lakefront property. But that ordinance really prevented them
Temporary. lakefront.
from redeveloping that property.
Do we have any other questions?
I have one more,
Go for
and then
it.
I'm done.
No, you're good. That's why we have David here.
So I think I know the answer, but I'm gonna ask it anyway. So when development, you know, site plans and development projects come through for rezoning or zoning confirmation, y'all, I'm assuming, are not involved. That would be city stormwater. Is there a point at which they would get you involved or ask for your opinion or for your input based on the streams and areas that you guys monitor as opposed to the areas they monitor?
So one of the ways that we, I guess, get our leads, so to speak, is through actually the permitting process. So if we see permits getting pulled on a flood prone property, John kind of starts investigating,
Right.
goes to work.
Every parcel that touches the floodplain, it's an automatic hold for permits.
But as far as like the rezonings and things like that, we look at that generally from the water quality you know, if we can get easements for doing restoration work on the creeks and streams now. But also our regulatory people, our permitting compliance people do look at those and make sure that, you know, they know these areas are floodplain. You know, these structures or whatever are in the floodplain and or any implications of the substantial improvement, substantial damage, those sorts of things all gets communicated back through the process.
So that would be more when they get to an actual site plan and kind of civil plans.
I
and
think this is
more so than during the zoning.
whatever, I don't
process.
remember, I can't remember what it takes for a rezoning. There
Yeah,
is some
It's
planning,
changed now,
I
so
think
that's
it's
probably
like
part of why, yeah.
sketch plan or something
Right,
like
sketch
that.
plan review or whatever.
Which is not, I don't think they have met all the regulatory requirements. It's
Right.
just for people to kind of
Right.
get an idea of what they want.
So you guys will get pulled in at that point if it's something that hits the threshold.
There are
in a
people that
FEMA
look at that.
floodplain or-
There are people that, we don't look at those, but there are people that do in our shop.
Right. Thank you.
So, because the Ray Road Adventure, I talked to Brendan Smith. Is he in the same group you guys are in or different
I don't know.
group?
He's with the city.
City, okay, so the city is, because in a zoning perspective, on a couple of occasions, we've had rezonings that have come forward and the neighbors come in and all of a sudden they show a video of the area underwater, flowing away, like whatever, and city council can be swayed by things. I'm just gonna stop right there. And so the issue of stormwater comes up. And from a zoning committee perspective, it's like, sometimes it would be good for us to have someone there that can say, well, this isn't really a problem. This was a once in every 50-year flood, or, if they mitigate to the 25-year floodplain, we'll be happy. That's the city folks that I need to get to come to that meeting, or do you guys need to come to that meeting?
So there's flooding in the minor system, no question.
Yeah.
They don't do this sort of evaluation on the little creeks and streams or the pipes. We really are more focused on the larger streams, the FEMA streams, the streams draining
Yeah.
a square mile or more.
Yeah.
So it would depend. If the flooding is on one of these larger creeks, it's us for sure.
Okay.
If it's like a neighborhood pipe is clogged and causing water backups and stuff like that, then that's the city.
I just know that the Ray Road Adventure is swelling to
Are
hopefully.
you talking about the rezoning down there?
Yeah,
Yeah, okay.
yeah. That hopefully that's swelling to conclusion, but I did receive a lot of email with pictures of water running down the hill during the previous storm, and that's what the water's supposed to do, right?
That's right.
And I looked at the floodplain map and it appeared to me that everything was above the 100-year just because of the topography of that area. It's like a 70-foot grade from the top of the hill down to the creek. So, 70 feet of water was going to be a lot. But I want to have somebody that can answer the questions more technically, just in case somebody pokes me real hard,
Yeah, so that's major system, that's us.
Okay, all right, probably
Absolutely. And we've
Prob-
actually talked with
bug
a
you.
number of citizens down there about that. And
Yeah.
I mean, it's a big floodplain. It's a big wide floodplain. There's a lot of wetlands down there.
Yeah.
It's an active floodplain, no question
Okay,
about it.
we'll hook up after the meeting.
Sure.
Anybody else? All right, just one quick last thing, hopefully. As you see in this committee, we deal with the mandatory referrals every month. Douglas and his zoning committee are frequently on GIS looking at all the different rezonings. For our own education, as we look on GIS, on the floodplains, there are kind of 4 different tiers, right? I had it pulled up earlier, and then what were they? It was like the FEMA floodway, community floodway, and then FEMA versus community floodplain.
Browser window here.
So,
I guess I'm in one, aren't I?
Yeah. right, so just as we're looking at those, and then also, do you guys have any sort of control over the administration of the swim buffers and or the post-construction buffers?
The control is in each jurisdiction's ordinance. We administer those buffers for City of Charlotte, Mint Hill, Matthews. I don't think we administer them, but they are in the local jurisdiction, city and the town's ordinances.
And correct me if I'm wrong, swim buffers are the most restrictive.
Swim buffers and post-construction buffers are basically equivalent. It's
Okay,
just a post-construction is a more modern term. We implemented the swim buffers before anybody else in the state.
Oh.
Then the state decided, everybody's got to do this. So then this post-construction process. And so our swim buffers are basically just folded in to the post-construction buffer ordinances.
Got
That was, I think the post-construction buffers may extend a little bit further upstream to smaller streams
Got it.
than the swim buffers,
And
at
then
least in this city. of
As it
Charlotte.
relates to GIS, I think that Hillside and Westfield is probably a good area to kind of pull. for
Hillside
the
and Westfield.
Floodplain, yeah.
All right, let me figure out where I am. Freedom Park, that's close.
Yeah, right there. Perfect.
Hillside. So that's the structure that I was referring to earlier, that we bought. It's not green yet, you can tell James. Yeah, so you can get to the, I'll show you a couple things here. You can turn on the floodplains. And the four different areas. Oops. Now I screwed up. There it is. How do I go backwards? Legend. The four different areas, the cross-hatched area of the floodplain is called the FEMA floodway. That is the most restrictive. Don't build there. If you see a structure in the floodway, like you can see this entire lot was encompassed by the floodway. The only thing we do, the only mitigation we do in the floodway is acquisition and demolition. We would like to see every house that's in the floodway, anything that's in the floodway gone.
That's where we would expect to see high velocity water.
Deep, high velocity water. Second one, community floodway, is we have local, the FEMA floodway is required nationally. We also have a local floodway that is developed using future conditions. So at build out, we try to make a guess at what the build out land use is going to look like and how much of an increase in flooding are we going to have from that. So the FEMA floodplain only looks at the existing built environment. And then our community, our local floodway looks at the end point and says, how much worse is it going to get? And then you have the FEMA floodplain, which is, yeah, there's flooding there, but it's not quite as high a velocity water. Our ordinances allow development in that area as long as you're 2 feet above the predicted elevation. And then the community floodplain, again, that's a floodplain that's developed looking at build out. How bad could it get in the future? So we have that property which we acquired selected. Okay, property details, not what I want. So that's what it used to look like. If you scroll all the way to the bottom on this leftmost window, you can see something called flood zone information. If you click that, it'll open this, what's called our 3D interactive, and you can get a lot more information about individual structures. You can't get that risk data, but you can get finished floor is 1.9 feet below the FEMA base flood elevation. That means there's flooding in the living space, and you can get our elevation data. So the elevation data is what we use to calculate all that risk. And so you can see the base flood elevation from FEMA is 611.7. That's an elevation number. And then the lowest finished floor is 609.8. So you can see it's about 2 feet of water during that FEMA, the 100-year flood, which is what's used to define the FEMA. So all this data is available through that flood zone information link, which all you have to do is bring up a property and you can link to it. I don't like that drop down coming up. Close this thing now.
Perfect. David, are you still looking at something or are we kind of?
I was gonna try to back up, but I'm not having a whole lot of
I think you have to go to the previous
up
tab.
here. I keep hitting that thing, doggone it. There we go. And then you can see here is a little bit zoomed in. There's the floodway. There's the community floodway, FEMA floodplain, and then community floodplain.
Perfect.
There's an awful lot of very large houses. Not necessarily in the FEMA floodplain, community. I mean, large houses.
Yeah. You can see them here.
Yeah. Yeah, I think Manor Drive is the one that's on the back of here.
Yep.
And I have friends over there, and they are in the remaining like 1,300 square foot bungalow. And they're surrounded by these 4,000 or 5,000 square foot houses.
Yep.
With huge roofs, and I've seen it become a lake over there. I'm just.
But you can see here the picture of this structure. This is a new one. How it's, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 steps up.
Yeah.
And so when they tear those old houses down that are prone to flooding, they're at least coming back with something that's compliant. But you notice that those garage spaces aren't 6 steps up. So water's gonna get in that garage, likely damage those cars if it happens at 2 o'clock in the morning. There's gonna be impacts, but like I said, our floodplain ordinance allows this. This is okay. It's not zero flood risk, but it is much lower flood risk than it once was.
From a floodplain ordinance perspective, we don't take into account the increased impervious area of the lot, so that's something that would just fall under whatever zoning regulations.
Yeah, and redevelopment, the post-construction, I don't think that kicks in, and I don't even think,
Construction even kick in on this?
for redevelopment, I think the state doesn't allow you to implement post-construction for redevelopment or something like that.
Because I know we have on single family, in one now, there's stormwater considerations on that now, so interesting if you redevelop something, you don't have to do stormwater stuff.
Yeah, this is just a single lot, quarter acre. I think it's grandfathered. I don't think you have to do stormwater controls, but you are not grandfathered from the floodplain ordinance. You've got to get it up.
Okay, all right.
But as far as treating the runoff, it's grandfathered, something that single lot sort of scale.
I thought technically, you weren't supposed to fill more than 50%. You weren't supposed to have more than 50%.
Yeah.
I'm sure I can find you examples in this area where that's been exceeded.
All those houses have this
Right.
much land on
Yeah.
either side of them.
David.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for your time this evening.
Pleasure.
John,
This has
thank you
been
for
great.
coming as
Thank you all
well.
for having me. This has been a really good exchange. I
Yeah, well,
appreciate you letting me
the
speak.
half hour turned into a little bit longer, so we really appreciate your
If you
time.
ever, John's coming back, you can do this again. Right? Just not like fish talking.
I will say, David, there were certain things in your presentation that I think would be great to share with some other commissioners that were not here tonight. Is that something that you could share with Kathy to distribute after this?
You've got it, right? Of
Oh,
course.
perfect. All right, great. We'll just want to make sure that's okay with you guys. Again, thank you both very much for being here. That was fantastic.
Our pleasure. Our pleasure. Thanks for having us.
I believe we have one more thing on the agenda, the annual report update. Gretchen, is that you and Tolu? Okay, perfect.
Good evening, everyone. We just have a brief presentation, and I just wanted to set the stage really quickly before turning it over to Tolu. For those of you who I have not met, I'm Gretchen Flores. I sit as part of the long-range planning team, and what our smaller program area is tasked with doing is really tracking how we're doing on the comprehensive plan. And so that kind of sets the stage for the presentation that you'll get tonight. In that smaller program area, we have myself, Tolu, Abby, and Jason, who you guys know. So I just wanted to introduce the team who's relatively new to the city. So I will kick it over to Tolu and then, yeah, take it from there.
Thank you, Gretchen. Good evening, everyone. My name is Tolu Ibikunle Ortiz. I have the I have the honor of providing you an overview of the Charlotte Future 2040 Comprehensive Plan Annual Report. For the purposes of this presentation, I will be referring to the comprehensive plan as the 2040 plan. The annual report is part of the implementation strategy of the 2040 plan. The first annual report was published last year, so this is technically the second annual report. The 2040 plan identifies the need for transparent reporting on the plan's implementation progress.
The second annual report was published last month and shares our progress to date. This presentation features an overview of looking at how we've grown over time, our current efforts, sharing our work and professional awards, and a look ahead. In 2023, Charlotte experienced a lot of growth. Charlotte is the 15th largest city in the US. Our population has increased to nearly 941,000 people, up roughly 61,000 people from the previous reporting year. There were nearly 23,000 new residential units that were constructed. Almost 15,000 new residential units were permitted for construction. Approximately 20 million heated square feet of new non-residential buildings were constructed, and about 4,200 commercial building permits were issued. Our current efforts listed in this report begin with the 2040 Planning Academy. The Planning Academy is a program that provides the opportunity to empower participants with the knowledge necessary to be engaged and involved in future planning processes in Charlotte. Guidance from the 2040 plan prompted the creation of 3 commissions to help implement some of the goals in the 2040 plan. The Policy Evaluation and Innovation Team, formerly known as the Implementation Program Area, provides staff support and resources where necessary for these commissions. Conference presentations serve as a platform for leaders to share innovative ideas, cutting-edge research, and best practices that contribute to the advancement of urban planning strategies. Now, to foster collaboration, long-range planning staff partnered with several other entities to engage with a diverse group of people from various backgrounds, all within the planning profession. Staff had the honor and privilege to participate in some of the best educational opportunities through the North Carolina American Planning Association, Congress for New Urbanism, which was held in Charlotte for the first time, so that's important to note, a global learning journey in Cape Town, South Africa, and Sustain Charlotte and Spur. We are excited to announce, again, for those who already know this, that the Charlotte Future 2040 Comprehensive Plan proudly received the 2023 Daniel Burnham Award for a comprehensive plan from the American Planning Association. So just so I set the stage, I want you all to know how big of a deal this is. This is like the Oscars, okay? This is like the Grammys. So tell everyone, if you haven't already, share it with everyone, your friends, your family, strangers, because this is a big deal. Additionally, the city was awarded the Marvin Collins Award for the 2040 plan. And our community was given the International Association for Public Participation Award for public engagement and named IAP2 USA Project of the Year. Please note, we published the 2022 awards because we received them after the first annual report was published. But isn't it an honor to be recognized on a global scale? Okay, next slide, please. Moving forward, the implementation of the Charlotte Future 2040 Comprehensive Plan will continue. A mid-year partner spotlight will share how other city and county partners are progressing in their implementation efforts. And finally, each program area within the long-range planning division will forge ahead with the community area planning process, 3D modeling to illustrate various concepts, and tracking and reporting progress. Now, we have hard copies available of the annual report, and I hope that you all take some this evening so you can share the information about what we've been doing, what we did in the past year, and what we will be doing in the future. And if you prefer an electronic version, on the screen there is a QR code available for you. That concludes my presentation. I'm available for questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tolu. That was fantastic. Do we have any questions from our commissioners here this evening?
I just have a comment. I love your enthusiasm. It's so wonderful. Thank you.
We love it too.
Thank you.
Nothing else? All right, well, look, thank you very much for the presentation. That was fantastic.
Thank you. Y'all have a lovely evening.
You as well. On that note, I think we've reached the end of our agenda. Anybody else have anything they want to discuss before we get out of here? All right, motion to adjourn, please.
Motion.
All right,
Second.
we're out.